Okay, I'm literally recording this right after I just recorded the other thing because I think I've overcome my weird inhibitions for some reason. I don't know why I'd have them, but I want because the idea I wanted to talk about is this. And so you're just going to have to bear with me for this because I'm just going to be talking without a script and I don't know quite where I'll end up. So I'm sorry about that. But I'm still going to do it because I want to get some ideas out there that I've been thinking about. And the idea that I want to get out here, which I touched ever so briefly on in one of, I think it was the Axis and Quadras video, that I implied it almost. Because I've been implying this connection between NE and FE. Because intuition and feeling, which is something Boyack and Wande talked about in his determining function axes. Him and Ryan Smith talked about it. And I think it's determining function axes part 4, or at least starts there, where he was the one who linked up feeling and intuition. Wolfgang Pauli, I think you can find a few places where Jung implies it, and then Wolfgang Pauli apparently really dug into it, the notion that feeling and intuition are more ideational. The term that I used was interpretative for a while, and then that was just really clunky, and so now I've thought of it different ways. But the point being that NE, just as FE is a more social function, and I've talked about this before, but I want to get even more into what precisely I mean when I say that. I also think that NE has this social side to it. I keep doing quotation marks. But I'm going to explain precisely what I mean when I say that. So I'm trying to think of the best place to start here. So, because it helps a great deal in understanding things to see contrasts. So, um, let's see how this goes. Because where I really started thinking, I really I've thought about this a lot, about this notion that NE is more social, is I've tried to understand precisely what bothers me sometimes when I have dealt with NE types, or people who have NE, INTPs, INFPs. I've noticed, and I always try to pay attention to this, when I find myself getting irritated with somebody because it's like, you're not looking at this right, or you're viewing things, and it's like I almost know, I just know that feeling when it's like, this is a typology difference. I think this is a typology difference I don't quite understand, and I want to try to isolate and understand it. And this is one of those things, as I've tried to understand at least one of the main reasons that I've gotten or can get irritated with NE. So where we're going to start is I've been trying to read Marx because I want to understand Marx, because everybody won't shut up about Marx, including myself. So I don't know why I'm grabbing the portable Marx. It's not like I'm going to read from it, but I was reading a little bit from Capital, or Capital, however you want to pronounce it. And I was trying to understand what, I just try to carefully read things and draw conclusions and things. And where does it start? Here we go. Obviously, I'm not reading the full Capital. I've been trying to get a hold of a copy just so that I have one, because it's sort of his magnum opus almost, as I've been told anyway. So what struck me as I was talking about it, I was working through it in my head, is Marx talks about, and I'll probably be misrepresenting elements of Marx, and that's okay, not because it's okay to misrepresent somebody, but because I'm only starting from Marx because I think it's a helpful job. I'm taking you through my thought process here that led me to my certain conclusions, and so I'm kind of just trying to take you along this long ride, so that it's easier for you to understand where I'm standing as I'm making this kind of contextual observation about NE. So one of the things that, as I understand it, Marx talks about is the fetishization. Okay, so the word is fetish. So you take fetishization, fetishization. The fetishization of commodities. Okay, what does that mean? Here's where I'll probably misrepresent or oversimplify, but for the purposes of understanding NE, here's how I'm viewing it. The fetish, you know what I'm talking about. Idolization, you could say, because a fetish, in the sense that he means it, a fetish is kind of like a, it's not quite like an idol, it's almost like a little idol, or like a little thing that a quote primitive people would endow with magical properties. And so you'd have these sort of magical fetishes, and so it's like it just sort of, the object itself holds this supernatural power. And so you transfer that into our time, where you have sexual fetishes, where something that is normally not associated with sex is now imbued with the sexual power. So people talk about a foot fetish or whatever. But the word, it originally comes from this notion of, you're imbuing this thing, which is essentially just a dumb idol, with this supernatural power. It's a fetish. And so Marx, when he talks about the fetishization of commodities, a commodity is something that, this isn't his precise definition, but it's something like, this is a commodity. My shirt's a commodity. That picture of Jesus is a commodity. It's something that somebody or some group of people put effort into creating, to sell in the marketplace. So they put their labor power into it, and then they traded it for something supposedly in exchange for the amount of labor power they put into it. So it's objects that we create. And so Marx, one of the points that he talks about is this notion that when capitalism, in his view, fetishizes or encourages the fetishization of commodities, meaning you imbue the commodity with this almost supernatural significance, which is separate from the point of having that commodity. I keep on saying, I'm super self-conscious here because I feel like I might be oversimplifying here, but because it's not, but I'm just going to keep following it. So for instance, you make this book so that you can read the information in the book, or you make a bed so you can sleep on a bed. You make things in Marx's view, you make things to support a human life, to enrich a human life, and to be able to continue surviving, and also to be a human being in this sense. And I'm going to get into what exactly I think is psychologically going on there for Marx when he talks about that. Same thing with Nietzsche and Rand, when they all talk about this notion of man being sort of the measure. It's highly contextual thinking. It's very, very FINISETE thinking, right? So I'll just go with this. His notion is that to fetishize a commodity means the commodity starts to take on this significance that is independent and more powerful than just its actual use. So, you get all these workers together to build beds. You get a bed factory and you build all these beds, and you build a surplus of beds, and the ones that you don't sell, you throw away or you sell later, or however it works. So the funny thing is that it starts to become that you spend all this time going into work, spending all this time out of your day to build this bed for somebody else. Why? It's a bed. All you need is, people just need beds to sleep on. Like, they just need a comfortable bed. But it's like the commodity and all the luxuries involved in the commodity have become a power that has taken over the life of the individual. So this is one of Marx's complaints, right? And he was very frustrated with, people who work the 9 to 5 to make stuff that they're not going to use, and that this seems very pointless because Marx is an INTJ and he don't have time for that kind of stuff. Very independent. And so this fetishization of commodities is where the commodity takes on a value that is not based in concrete actual use of the object. And now here's where things get interesting and where they get into personality, in my view, is because if I'm understanding Marx right, what he's doing is very, very INTJ, and by that I mean very in the INTJ quadra, where it's, like I said, TESE, FI, and I, which are the contextual axes. Contextual means, oh, how do I explain this? I've explained it before in some other videos, but the basic idea is SE and TE, they are, like, take SE, direct perception. So it's like you look at the object, you're staring straight at the object. SI is where you're not so much looking at the object as you are looking at this ideal form of the object, and you're kind of just comparing this thing with that ideal object. And so you're almost more looking at directly at the subject, at your own ideas of the thing. But SE, you're trying to push through that, get rid of that, and look at the object itself on its own in the world. Similar-ish thing with TE, except it's a judgment function, so it's not really you're seeing the thing, but I usually end up using seeing metaphors anyway. Your TE is about getting measurable results. So something is efficient when you can tell it's efficient, right? When you're able to see, okay, here's the facts, here's the statistics, the empirical data that demonstrates externally that this thing is working or that this thing is real. And so TE will, complain that the MBTI, the Big Five is superior to the MBTI because the Big Five has higher validity numbers, or however it's supposed to work. They want that external presence. It's a separate matter whether or not the person is, the TE person is actually trained very well in like actual statistics and how those things works. The point is that they need to feel, ironically, that the thing has an external presence, because that's when they're going to trust it. So it has that element. SE2 has that element where it's like it's going to pay more attention to things when they're bigger or they have a more objective presence. Here's where it gets interesting. It's only so, like, for instance, my face right now, or a better example is when I'm looking at this book, like this book is right now, when it's this close to my face, the biggest thing in the room. So SE is like, that is what's going to arrest my attention. For SE, it's the most important thing right now. But my head, from especially if I go this way, like my head is bigger than the book for you. You see what I'm saying? How big something is entirely subjective from your perspective, right? I shouldn't say it's subjective. It's only objective in reference to a particular person looking at it or a particular audience, right? That's the thing. So SE and TE, it's the same thing with TE, because something will only measure empirically on a certain scale. Or maybe a better way to put it is that, because what I'm getting at is this is a part of, I think, how they link into NI and FI. With TE-FI, I think it's a little easier to see what I'm talking about, because the facts that will matter, or what is considered sufficiently externally present to be considered real, will generally depend on the FI values of the person who is looking for those facts, right? Something is sufficiently efficient depending on what the FITE type is trying to accomplish. It's a similar deal with NISE, where something is more, a fact or an observation or something is more important and becomes more important in the person's view depending on where they stand, their context, and to put it another way, basically what they're trying to prove in the first place. So it's this dynamic. It doesn't totally reduce back to the subjective. I think it's a mistake to think that. It's a dynamic between what the person themselves sees directly before them and also what they themselves, given their position in the world, want to see in the world. And there's this back and forth that goes on. But the point is that for both of them, you get this very individual version, and I usually represent it as like a dot, a single point with like a circle around it representing the world from that dot's perspective. And then you have everybody as their own separate dot that has different perspectives. And they all kind of, so when you get somebody who is fully contextual, you'll often get these kinds of motifs, like especially with INTJs, Marx, Nietzsche, Rand, they all have this sense of fight, 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 where, because they have this sense of like, I'm this individual and everybody else has their own kind of context. And so we're just kind of we're always going to end up conflicting with each other in certain ways. It's inevitable because we all want different things. And so whoever is better at getting the things they want will win. And usually it's they're more nuanced in explaining it than that, but you get the idea. So that is SETENIFI. It tries to be very direct in seeing things, but it's ultimately very much determined by the needs of the subject. So returning to Marx, Marx is upset and irritated with the so-called fetishization, the fetishizing of commodities, because in his mind, you're getting separated from the use of the objects. He's always emphasizing this notion of we need to get back to the facts. We need to get back to what is actually happening in the real world, which is basically another way of saying get rid of your subject and just focus on what is actually there in the outside world without all of these subjective assumptions. What does the bed actually do for you? Like, why are you making this bed? Why are you, so he's trying to get rid of this supernatural element to the object. And what is he replacing it with? He's replacing it with, does the thing help you in your life? And you realize it's not objective in the way that you might normally think of objective, because you end up in this subjective realm. And people can say, and so here's where NE comes in, because in my view, Marx has set up kind of a system where you have, okay, at the base, you have this notion of the actual concrete, I'm misusing this term, but use value of the commodity. And so it's like ground floor, or at least that's the hope, is that there's this ground floor, and the ground floor is SETE. And what NE and to a certain degree FE, but let's focus on NE for now. So in Marx's view, there's the ground floor, and then you have like this superstructure, scaffolding that rises up from that ground floor. There we go. Now you can kind of see. Now it looks right. It rises up from that ground floor. It's like all this scaffolding kind of builds up, and it's all kind of useless. And that's the fetishization of the commodity, where you forget the whole reason that you started making things in the first place. You make food so you can eat it. And why are you making more food than you need to make in order to survive and feel, reasonably healthy and all that? You're making all this food. We throw away so much food because we've got to make it fresh, and we've got to make enough so that we can make more. I'm not doing this justice, but so Marx is like, well, get rid of that. So you've got all this scaffolding, which is the fetishization of the commodity, which is we make burgers because we make burgers. It starts to become that there is no other real reason. So the commodity, you're no longer focused on what you as an individual need. You're focused on the social structure. There we go. Finally, I found it. It's like I'm searching around in my brain for these things. That's why it takes me so long. So my apologies. So the scaffolding, it's a social structure where you go to work because that's what you do every day. And if you stop going to work, then people will look at you funny. and, worse than that probably, or assuredly. And that's a social matter. And its reality really depends on everybody's opinion of you, right? If you stop going to work, then they're not going to agree to give you certain things, right? And that's a very different matter than you being in the middle of the desert and, right? Because it's not, if you're in the middle of the desert and you're dying of thirst, you're going to die if you don't drink something. But if you're in the middle of a city and there's water, but the only reason you can't drink the water is because people won't allow you to, from Marx's perspective and from the SETE-NIFI perspective, that's almost like intolerable, because then this social structure is getting in the way of what you actually need as an individual in the real world. And so in some sense, your death would be a horrible mistake because there's water right there. If you're in the desert, then there's no mistake to be made. There's literally no water anywhere, unless you just don't know where to find it. But if you're in the city and you die because no one will let you have water, then that's a huge problem. So it's this social superstructure that Marx's solution, if you can call it that, is kind of to try to sweep aside all the social expectations and all this stuff, which are precisely what have said, you got to get a job, you've got to go to work, you've got to go and do certain things in order to make these commodities, and that view the commodities as almost holding this kind of supernatural power. And Marx can't stand that, because being more of an INTJ type, he and a very aggressive one to boot, he's kind of like, you got to sweep that all aside. I don't care what other people think. I don't care that you value this thing. I don't care how many people value this thing. What I value is what the thing actually does in reality. So he's referring back to SETE. So what NE does is NE takes issue with this kind of hierarchy thing where Marx is kind of like the scaffolding, which I'm relating to FE. Let's relate it to FE for now, where it's all these social expectations. So that's where you get into NE and NEFESITI are, as a whole, they're not individualist axes. They're more social axes. I've used the term universalist or fair-minded. And so as a whole axis, what is going on is when you hold an internal reality, so rather than you looking out at the world to see what reality is, looking at the objects on their own from your perspective, you try to hold a view of reality that is independent of your own perspective on it, right? So you're trying to transcend the little pinpoint. You're trying to transcend your own narrow point of view. How do you do that? You talk to other people. You've got to talk to other subjects who have other points of view. That's why NE always wants to discuss things with people. FE also kind of wants to discuss things with people. It wants to know, it's determined and orients itself in terms of what other people value and completely ignores what it values. In a certain sense, it doesn't value anything of itself. It doesn't have that internal valuing. It's always orienting itself in terms of what it perceives other people to value and trying to find a compromise from all those things. So they are 100% in this realm, this scaffolding realm of what other people think. NE does not, so NE is a social function. It took me forever to get to this point, sorry. NE is a social function insofar as, I don't know if people will get irritated with me for this, but NE is objective only insofar as it asks other people what they think. It's not looking at anything in the world, because there's no actual way to do that, right? Kant's problem, right? You're only ever looking at things from your own perspective through your own apparatus of perception. You can't get to the noumena. So SE you can't have, it's a contradiction in terms to have SE that is actually transcontextual, right? SE will always be from the point of view of an actual viewer, and will always be limited by that. And the only way to transcend that is through an NE method, but it's not direct. You're not directly perceiving the nature of the object itself. You are relying upon what other people think about the object, and you're trying to average things out. As a result, NE becomes a much more social function, because I don't see where else it could get its truth from. When it approaches truth, it approaches it because the aggregate of other people's opinions has actually brought it closer to the truth. But sometimes that's not the case. And then you need somebody with SE, like maybe not Marx, but somebody else. Sorry, I keep on like passive aggressively poking Marx. I don't know why. It's an FE reaction almost, because I know that people don't like Marx, so it's almost like unconsciously I just naturally am like, well, I'm going to acknowledge the fact that that there's all these people who don't like Marx. But then I feel bad about it because I know there's other people who really do like Marx. So then I make this long explanation in the middle of my video. So anyway, when I myself am indifferent, I wouldn't say I'm indifferent, but I'm confused about Marx. I don't know what to think about the guy. So I'll have to formulate opinions about that later. But returning to what we were talking about, so you get somebody with SE or TE or NI or something. They come in and either on a judgment area or a perception area, they're going to come in and say, you all are completely caught up in this crazy scaffolding of all these assumptions that you just take for granted. We're just going to knock that whole tower over and start fresh. But of course, what they usually forget to mention or don't even realize is that by starting fresh, they mean starting fresh from my point of view, looking in at all of this, right? And sometimes they can get closer to the truth. Other times they can actually get you further from the truth, because depending on what the person's point of view is. So, right, that would be what people argue about Marx, and that's also why SETE, they can be, or those axes can be very forceful in how they say things, because they're simply reporting what they see. And so it's truth, especially with SENI. I would argue that NI is never actually incorrect. Its truth or falsity consists entirely in how applicable is the NI observation to other people and their lives. I think that any NI observation, by definition, is correct. The question is, how much can that correct observation be universalized? So if you were able to stand in the precise point where the NI user stood when they made the observation, and you looked at it in the exact same way that they did, then you'd realize, oh, it's a perfectly valid observation. But if all you're looking at is this one little point on the elephant, then you might completely misconstrue, as far as other people are concerned, and as far as their lives are concerned, the nature of the elephant or the object that you're talking about. And so, so what happens is with NES, or rather NEFE, when it's a very different version where you're trying to transcend the context. And so in order to do that, you have to hold this view of reality that is always really kind of in opposition to the direct sense experience around you, or the direct measurable results around you. Popper, Karl Popper, the falsification method, and his numerous, he's very kind of NTP and very, very cynical and critical of NI thinking, which in his mind was where you just kind of went off and made all these positive assertions, and in Popper's view, it's like all of that is just from your individual point of view, and therefore it's not based on anything that is more sure from Popper's point of view. So he comes up with these very indirect negative methods for trying to get closer to truth, which he feels much more comfortable with. So in order to get to your SITI point, where you feel like you hold a reality that, although it's in contradiction to what is immediately around you, it is in harmony with the entire universe as a whole, which in turn can be problematic depending on whether or not the entire universe as a whole is actually relevant to what you as a single individual are doing. I got to Kierkegaard. Let's talk about Kierkegaard really quick. I know I'm going all over the place, but we need to talk about Kierkegaard because I understand Kierkegaard better now. Okay, I talked about it a bit in my Kierkegaard nutshell video, but what Kierkegaard is doing, and it's so emblematic of the INFP, is Kierkegaard is this wonderful, he's caught between these two poles of NE and FI. The one is universal, and the other is particular or contextual. FI is the contextual one. So what Kierkegaard's goal, his plan, what he's trying to do is he says, okay, you start from this, you know, like an either or, where you have the one, blah, 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 blah. NE, perception, transcontextual perceptions. You see all these different possibilities. You see all these different possible ways of looking at reality that are not your own, that are not, you know, and NE in a sense doesn't even know what that would mean, in the very similar way that FE does not understand what FI means when it asks it what it's feeling. FI asks FE, what are you feeling? And FE's like it doesn't even know how to answer. I don't even know how to answer. It's like, because literally there is nothing there. Nothing there in the sense that FI wants to see something there, because FE, literally, it's like you took that internal rod of feeling, you know, that was running through you, you took it and you expanded it out. So now it's like this big tube that you are enclosed in, and there is no you. It's all been dissipated into the universe. I don't know if any of those images made any sense. But you get the idea. Same thing with NE and NI, where if you ask NE, what is your opinion? That might not be the best way to phrase it. I'm kind of spitballing here, but it would be something like that, where you'd say, what is your vision? What is your opinion, your conclusion? NE probably wouldn't know. I don't know if that's the best way to phrase it, but I would bet there's a way to phrase it so that NE would become tongue-tied in a similar way that FE becomes it, because NE is like, I don't do anything. I don't have a conclusion. I can tell you what conclusions there